Bueno, vale. ¿Ya? Okay, we're gonna start.
Okay, so just to clarify about the nature of this talk, you were sent the text error in advance, which Rob explained is going to be a text for MX4. The reason that we decided not to present the error text now is partly because it turns out it's going to be the topic of a long discussion tomorrow. So we wanted to try and put together something a little bit new for the sake of the presentation. Also, we don't really generally like to just kind of read papers because find it difficult to kind of engage more. So what we have here is essentially a massive list of points which we're going to try and talk about. So the text error, which we'll be discussing tomorrow, is, I mean, all of the projects that we have in the endnotes are very much collaborative in the sense that they are the products of quite often quite long, involved discussions with the whole group. But of course, quite often individual or, you know, in small groups, we will kind of write text. So the text error is a text that Rob has specifically been working on. It's kind of his project. But so what we're going to present today is a kind of collaboration between Rob and I, where we're trying to sort of make more precise some key ideas that he's trying to articulate in the error, but also to develop them in some way.
And to connect them to subsumption.
Yeah.
Because that was a topic of this event. So.
Exactly. So we've tried to kind of focus in a little bit more on the topic of subsumption. And I was kind of thinking of watching this workshop, which has been really, really amazing to be part of, and all the papers have been really solid and kind of substantial, but also I was kind of thinking, well, in some ways this paper might have been good to go first in the workshop because in some way it's more kind of analytical, I guess, and it's trying to kind of spell out with more precision what the problem of real subsumption is. But then also I was thinking that it's great to come after all the papers that we've seen today, and there's so many resonances and similarities and echoes in the different papers. So you can kind of think of this as an analytical frame whose content is being poured in. It's kind of Marina, Dimitra, and Anthony and the others.
That sounds like a bit of an act of violence.
It's an act of violence, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk slowly and clearly as possible, but if it gets too fast, or just tell me to slow down. So what is to be done under real subsumption? Lots of people like to throw around Marx's concept of subsumption, real and formal these days. This has been particularly the case in discourses around communization, but also elsewhere. And artists and art theorists also seem especially drawn to this concept. It seems to do a lot of work for them. But for us, most of this talk of real subsumption involves cases of what we call a false totalisation. But just to say, so we're going to go and talk through what we mean by false totalisation and the way in which subsumption can be one. But I just wanted to make it clear at the beginning that this isn't just a kind of pedantic, petty debate about the proper application of a concept or of terms, which would be annoying. But the problem with false totalisation is actually a very general one, and it has a very significant bearing on the character and outcomes of revolutionary theory. And so for this reason, the critical examination of problems with real subsumption can lead us out into some more important general problems, which hopefully we'll be able to bring out in the debate afterwards. So we should be clear at the beginning that we don't mean to just completely dismiss the idea of subsumption as though, you know, people who use subsumption are somehow kind of wrong or deluded or it's stupid or silly. There is, of course, something which feels immensely plausible in thinking about the present moment as one of a deep and generalised and kind of intensified subsumption onto capital. And we want to take that idea seriously, but at the same time kind of be critical of the use of subsumption to describe those things. So let's look firstly at some of the factors that make it seem plausible. So we could talk about the global triumph of capital over its previous antagonists in the last few decades, which has generalised a sense of capital's domination. The triumph has made it more or less impossible to think realistically of alternatives or outsides to capital's realm of domination. If capital's totality is equated with what it dominates, given that capital is almost entirely lacking in major challenges, then this totality would seem to be, it would appear to be, all-embracing. During the current phase, we've seen the extension of markets and pseudo-market logics to realms that were previously free of such things. And this can give us the impression that capital is simply completing or completed its totality. The end of the workers' movement has meant that collective bargaining has mostly given way to a complete individualisation of negotiations over the wage relation. People now tend to relate to capital directly in the marketplace, either as a seller or of labour or as a consumer, in both cases as a bourgeois subject. Most of humanity has now been separated from the land, with more than 50% now living in cities. And almost everyone reproduces themselves from one day to the next on the basis of capitalistically produced goods, purchased as commodities. So in all these ways, capital's domination seems to have been, or at least to be, in the process of being completed. It confronts us whichever way we turn, being the sole basis of our very reproduction.
Oh yeah, by the way, we're going to keep swapping backwards and forwards because it's a collaborative thing.
Just to hold your attention, otherwise it'll get boring.
So to turn to the question of subsumption itself, what this is in a technical sense, we're going to just quickly recap some things which were in the article in Endnotes 2. They might be a bit boring and familiar if people know that article well. If so, tell me. But hopefully, maybe this will help if some people don't know that article really. So the concept of subsumption, its distinction into two phases, occurs in the drafts of Capital, especially in 1861 and 63, between those years, and in the results of the immediate production process, which nowadays is an appendix to the English Standard Edition of Capital Volume 1. The concept of subsumption barely occurs, however, in the final version of Capital, although the idea can be read as informing some chapters. For this reason, the concept played no significant role in classical Marxism or in revolutionary discourses in general until around the 60s or 70s. At that high point in struggles, lots of people looked to obscure previously unexamined aspects of Marx in the attempt to find stimulation for new modes of revolutionary politics and theory. And it was in that context that lots of people seized upon the concept of subsumption from those drafts of Capital. It had the appeal as a concept, it seems, that it gave a conceptually precise way to distinguish between these two phases, which seemed to offer a tool for periodisation. And given that was an era of breaks, ruptures, and so on, when people were, it seemed, experiencing a significant break, perhaps that heightened the interest in that type of category. So it should be stressed that subsumption is quite a strange term to be used in a kind of political or political economic realm, in the sense that its origins are from logic or ontology. It's related to the subsumption of particulars under a universal. Subsumption is the relation of a universal to particulars. So whales, or the concept whale, might be subsumed under the category of mammal. In German idealism, this process of universal being applied to particulars, coming over particulars, is treated as a process. In Kant, it applies to the understanding, the concepts of the understanding, their relation to the manifold. But Hegel finds that the externality that this implies between universal and particular to be absurd, because it would seem to do a violence to that particular and obscure it. And he has this alternative notion of the concrete universal, which would not obscure the particular but would exist through it. Hegel does, however, apply the concept of subsumption in the philosophy of right to the decision of the sovereign. So this seems to be the key point at which this logical stroke ontological concept becomes a political or political economic term, something of which the young Marx was highly critical. But then there is a certain irony that he then goes on to use the term in a comparable fashion later. For this reason, because it originates in this logical, ontological sense, we have to distinguish this term from pure domination. There's something else that's going on in this concept other than domination. It makes particular sense in describing capital's relation to the labour process. This is because this relation involves the power of an abstract universal, capital or self-valorising value, being applied to a mass of concrete particularities. This power of capital over these rich particularities also has a certain absurdity. They all become reduced to mere moments of this abstract generality. So in being subsumed, they're obscured by and subordinated to capital. And in the process, they actually become part of capital. But it must be noted that this peculiar relation to the valorisation process can only plausibly be said of the labour process. There's nothing external to the production process that actually becomes capital in this way. While capital dominates and deeply affects lots of things, it doesn't subsume anything other than the labour process, if by this we mean this strict logico-ontological sense. If we use the concept of real subsumption to refer to other things beyond that valorisation process, it would seem that we misleadingly imply that these have a comparable logico-ontological relation to capital, when they can only really be said to be dominated by it. For this reason, it's kind of useful to think of real subsumption expanded into the full form that Marx would say it normally, which is the real subsumption of the labour process under the valorisation process, or something similar. So this restricted definition ties this concept very closely to the absolute and relative surplus value. As I guess a lot of people already know, formal subsumption tends to be associated with absolute surplus value, and real subsumption with relative surplus value, because it's only through real subsumption and the transformation of the labour process in various ways that the necessary part of the working day can be reduced and thus relative surplus value extracted. This distinction between absolute and relative surplus value is a technical one, and generally speaking not one that applies historically, although there are some people, such as Nick, the text that was mentioned earlier, do try to speculate maybe this phase was more about absolute surplus value, this phase more about relative surplus value. There's perhaps some possibility of making those kinds of periodizations, but it's quite difficult to be very precise about those questions. the thing to note here is that really relative surplus value is what makes capitalism capitalism. If it wasn't for relative surplus value, you wouldn't have capitalism. You can't really have a capitalism that is only about absolute surplus value. It wouldn't be the specifically capitalist mode of production if it was only about absolute surplus value. As such, a phase of the extraction of absolute surplus value only really makes sense as a moment on the way into extraction of relative surplus value or real subsumption. Although capitalism did have to come into the world through taking hold of something that already existed, it isn't clear that we can kind of establish that as any actual phase that had a delimited historical period or whatever. So for these reasons, we have to read formal real subsumption just like absolute and relative surplus value, primarily in technical or perhaps minimally temporal terms rather than historical terms. They're relative concepts that only mean something really in relation to each other, and which help us think about the temporality of capital's revolutionisation of production. And so, for that reason, real subsumption can't just be a contingent historical development of a historically prior process of formal subsumption. It only makes sense in relation to it. It is also not meaningful to consider it as a state, because it only makes sense as a process. So we can't delimit any specific term.
Okay, so but might there be any way of expanding this narrow notion of subsumption? It's a notable characteristic of the attempts to use the concept of real subsumption to designate a historical phase that these also tend to extend the notion of real subsumption beyond the labour process. As we've seen, this makes a lot of intuitive sense in the current period. There's no doubt that it's real subsumption or the extraction of relative surplus value that gives capital its dynamism and propels it to dominate the world. Nor is there any doubt that little is left unaffected by this. The question is whether this means that real subsumption usefully applies to all of these things. Given that it clearly applies to the whole of capitalist history and is technically restricted to the labour process, this can't literally be the case. But perhaps other things might be subsumed in other ways. Nothing in what we're saying rules this out necessarily. If it's specified that it's not subsumption under capital, i.e. the valorisation process itself that we're speaking of. For example, we might consider speaking of the formal and real subsumption of use values under exchange value, or even perhaps the subsumption of proletarians under the wage or some similar formulation, labour under variable capital perhaps. But it's worth noting here that those two examples that I just gave are themselves entwined with the capitalist production process. Perhaps we might return to Hegel, for example, and think about the subsumption of civil society under the sovereign. It's a question mark. Wherever we can specify a relation of subordination and incorporation of the concrete into the abstract, we might use the term subsumption. But generally speaking, this isn't what it seems that people are doing when they expand real subsumption as an epochal or general social category. Rather, they tend to either confuse capital's simple domination with its subsumption, or they confuse the effects, what we see to be the effects of capital's dynamism, with its base in the production process. So we view this sort of illegitimate extension of the concept of subsumption as a case of what we're calling false totalisation. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about what that means. So we think that the notion of totality is a kind of key conceptual determinant of a revolutionary theoretical problematic. It's a kind of defining feature of revolutionary theory. Although not all revolutionary theory recognises itself as having it. So, generally speaking, most of the time, most people fail to clarify what concept of totality may be implied in their thinking. In some cases, this is okay, but when making universalising theoretical claims about revolution, it becomes a significant problem. So there's a general kind of everyday common sense understanding of totality in which it's just the all or the whole or of something or that everything. It might be the totality of factors determining some situation, for example. Reference to totality here implies a consideration of everything involved, with perhaps a certain stress on qualitative over quantitative considerations. A notion of totality is implied when we speak of revolutionary overcoming of the capitalist mode of production, in that this makes it a revolutionary matter rather than a mere kind of piecemeal reform. A revolutionary overcoming of the capitalist mode of production, in some sense, specifically means an overcoming of that mode of production in its totality. If totality here means that all of the capitalist mode of production, we at least need to specify what is included in this all, if our notion of revolution is to have any meaning. So, for example, will communism require the overcoming of gravity, or of thinking in concepts per se, or of agriculture, or of maybe more controversially friendship, or of the fixedness of all things? Are all these things in some sense inextricably entwined with the capitalist mode of production? In Capital, Marx presents the capitalist mode of production as quite clearly articulated totality. Needless to say, gravity is not one of its moments, though it's probably one of its preconditions, since it's a condition of the existence of an orderly universe. That's still legitimate. Some clearly identifiable moments of the capitalist mode of production. So, for example, we can talk about identifiable moments of the capitalist mode of production. For example, the commodity, capital, surplus value, wage labour, the distinction of labour and labour power, a moment of reproduction of the worker beyond the immediate production process, exchange value versus use value, abstract labour, money as universal equivalent, etc. The totality or the all, which these moments, along with some others, make up, is not just a kind of general, vague or generic all of a list, like a kind of aggregate, or some quantity of diverse things. In distinction from an aggregate or a list, there's something very specific about the all. It is that all of these distinct moments not only add up to some higher unity, but that they are all dependent on one another in specifiable ways in their distinction. It's also worth being clear that the totality itself is nothing other than the unity of these distinct but interdependent moments. It does not exist in some way separate from or over and above them, some kind of mystical. When we postulate a revolutionary overcoming of the capitalist mode of production, the totality at stake in this thought is the one which is the unity of all of these interdependent moments. And also, since these moments are all dependent on one another, an overcoming of the totality itself implies not just overcoming the overall systemic unity, but also the individual moments themselves. So, through our definition of totality. We've clarified kind of specific contentful concept, at least a kind of baseline conceptual content, contentful concept of revolution, even if the content that this concept currently has is entirely negative. We call the type of totality that's at stake here a determinate totality. Determinate because a kind of shape emerges of it which has limits of some sort.
Or because the things which make it up themselves have limits. They're definable in relation to each other. It should be stated clearly right away, though, that what we're not doing is drawing a clear perimeter around the mode of production as a totality, as if it was a sort of ontological sphere which lots of other things can fall outside of. I think this is kind of a product of a certain sort of visualization, a visualizing metaphor. This is particularly pronounced, I think, because the easiest way to sort of think about what totality is to kind of think of a circle of interlinked elements or something like that. But yeah, we have to remember that it's just a sort of a metaphor for a concept, really, rather than something that we can directly draw conclusions from. Because there are certain spatializing, there are problems that can be produced by this kind of metaphor, such as spurious debates about what things are inside the totality and which things are outside the totality, where its edges are, and so on. The mode of production is fundamentally a way of producing things, and ways of doing things don't tend to have insides, outsides, and edges. So the way to sort of avoid these kind of spurious disputes, I think, is to shunt them onto the level of a kind of systematic theory which demonstrates the interdependence of these different moments of the totality. Thus, if we want to talk about something as part of the totality, the thing is that we just have to demonstrate how it is systematically interconnected with all these other things, rather than simply asserting it. If we can do so, then then that is a valid form of totalisation, we might say. Until you can do that, any assertion that something is part of a totality, such as the capitalist mode of production, is just conjecture, really. The totality lies outside it as this pure universal, unrelated to the particular thing. So that would be a case of what we call false totalisation. Another type of false totalisation, though, which is perhaps more severe, would be where there's no sense of articulation of the elements at all. There's just an assertion of the whole sort of vague sense. That would be a sort of purely mystical notion. So between those two, you might think of there being sort of degrees of falseness, with maybe just slight uncertainties about how we should think about capitalism being reasonable and legitimate, but obviously one wants to avoid anything that's completely empty if we're going to have any sort of clear notion of what it would mean to even have a revolution. We'd be making a false totalisation if we include a random shopping list of things in our abolisher's itinerary beyond the specific moments that demonstrably make up the determinate totality that's the object of revolutionary theory. But also, don't get us wrong here. The point is not that lurking beneath these false totalizations there is a pristine 10-point plan of action for making the revolution. It's just waiting to be uncovered. Reality itself is more recalcitrant, and the problems facing us more difficult than that. So it can't be just a matter of ideology critique.
Okay, so now I'm going to turn to an examination of kind of example of expanded usage of subsumption as cases of false totalisation. we're actually going to focus on TC, on Thierry Communiste in particular, partly for time constraints, but also because we think that they play such a major role in framing and establishing the discourse on communalisation, which is a major thread for people at this event. But also, they're the example of this extension of subsumption who seem to us to have the best kind of version, or the best articulated theory and notion of a totality. There are a lot of weaker examples that we could pick on, but it just seems, yeah, like we're going to take the kind of best example, I think. And theirs is probably the least false of the false ones. As we've seen, the falseness of false totalities can be a matter of degree. Hopefully we can collectively discuss afterwards in the discussion like how other kind of similar critiques could be made of other thinkers, and we have a few suggestions of other thinkers. So TC have of course long employed formal and real subsumption in the periodisation of cycles of accumulation and struggle. In this periodisation, these terms map roughly onto the phases present in closely analogous periodisations, particularly that of the regulation school. Formal subsumption characterises the phase of capitalist development leading up to what Aglietta termed Fordism, in which workers were still in some sense potentially capable of reproducing themselves independently of the capital relation. Real subsumption characterises the return to Fordism, when capitalist societies form themselves into fully fledged modern capitalist nation states, in which macroeconomics is something for the state to watch over, and aggregate demand internal to an economy becomes a fundamental issue. Essentially, it's when workers internal to the economy become the main systemic source of demand, as well as the supply of labour, and thus capitalism becomes an integrated system of which class struggle is an internal moment. So then there's a second phase of real subsumption, which characterises a shift beyond these initial arrangements, mapping onto post-Fordism, or what others would call neoliberalism. And we all know what this phase is like.
So yeah, we do think this periodisation captures a lot. I mean, there's a lot more rich detail in their periodisation that we could have captured there, but for the sake of space, for the time limit, we won't go into it. There is a lot that it captures about the real historical development of capitalist societies. And it's obviously no coincidence that TC's periodisation has the same phase as almost every other Marxist periodisation out there, or at least a hell of a lot of them. But even setting aside the technical issues that we've looked at around the concept of subsumption, though, there are certain problems with this periodisation. So given TC's proximity to regulationism, it's instructive to turn to Robert Brenner's empirically grounded critique of the regulationist periodisation. We won't go through Brenner's long and intricate argument here, but just to highlight some salient issues. What were workers in conditions of formal subsumption doing, selling their labour for wages, if they weren't already fundamentally dependent on purchasing commodities with those wages? If workers were buying commodities with their wages, who was producing those commodities? Surely not tenant farmers. How could capitalist societies in conditions of formal subsumption support a large number of workers living in towns if agriculture hadn't already had its productivity significantly increased? Wasn't this increase through capitalisation and real subsumption? If that productivity had been significantly increased through technical changes, wasn't the extraction of relative surplus value already something socially general? It becomes apparent when we start sort of probing this notion of a phase of formal subsumption, or this kind of early phase in their periodisation, that it's not really sustainable in the kind of categorical, systematic way that they want to think about it. But then the more we look at it, it increasingly takes on the characteristics of fully fledged real subsumption. while this might seem at first glance a mere historical matter, unimportant to our understanding of the current phase, the implication of these issues aren't trivial. This is because the distinction between formal and real subsumption is essentially the only one that gives the periodisation a systematic rather than an ad hoc, contingent, descriptive quality. TC's second phase of real subsumption does not involve a shift at the same depth as that implied between formal and real. It doesn't imply that sort of categorical kind of transition. Its transformations are deep and fundamental, but they're nonetheless only internal to an already existing, fully constituted capitalist mode of production. If real subsumption seems to include on a second glance what TC called formal subsumption, then all we have is one long phase of real subsumption, albeit with various sub-phases, which we might characterise in other terms. But a periodisation with only one period is, of course, not a periodisation at all. To refer to the current historical period then, this links back to our technical discussion about subsumption before, is essentially identical to referring to this current period as the phase of capitalism. So the question, what is to be done under real subsumption, becomes what is to be done under capitalism, which is indistinguishable from Lenin's what is to be done. As well as every other Marxist, every other anarchist, indeed anyone concerned with the mode of production itself throughout capitalist history. So if there is something specific about the question of what is to be done now, posing these kind of practical questions or how to look at struggles or whatever, it can't be captured in terms of this concept. There's, I think, where we can talk about, I'm going to have to ad-lib this now because we haven't written this part, where we can talk about false totalisation specifically in relation to TC is that it's, for them, the generalisation of real subsumption to society in a more general sense justifies, but it's justified essentially by the fact that there's the reproductive moment. There's a reproductive moment which occurs sort of in the gap between the two ends of the production process. They seem to think that sort of implies the whole rest of capitalist society, without the mediations being specified. They talk about mediations in a kind of ad hoc sense, like unions and certain modes of kind of state practice or whatever, collective bargaining, etc. But there's no sense in which the social whole which is implied in that it has any systematic quality. You have, on the one hand, this very systematic notion of the mode of production, and then because there's this sort of gap where reproduction happens, and because that is centrally put in play by real subsumption, because in real subsumption it's necessary that the goods which the worker consumes are being essentially cheapened, and so, or their labour content being reduced. There's a sort of elision where that becomes the excuse to kind of, for potentially anything in capitalist society to come in play in the totality that's at stake. So that's the sense in which we'd say that it seems that there's a false totalisation at play in TC's notion of real subsumption. We're going to just finish on some questions.
So because it was quite a technical paper, and we apologise after the fact for that, but we wanted to sort of end on some questions which is based more about the kind of struggle question, what are we to do, and we're kind of hoping that we can have a really good debate about this, but I think the questions also kind of resonate with some of the other papers, or we wrote them thinking of some of the other papers as well. So, I mean, that there will obviously be other questions that you want to ask and answer as well, but these are just kind of like suggestions of things that we might discuss if you agree with what we've said. So the first question is just trying to think about, so when we were writing the paper we focused on TC, but there were several thinkers that we could have talked about, and if we were to develop this idea more, the idea would be to kind of do a thorough reading of each of these thinkers and to try and kind of reveal the specific way in which they formulate a kind of false totalisation. So we think there are analogous critiques of real subsumption to be made as false totalisation. So, for example, Kamat, Negri, kind of art theorists like Stuart Martin, perhaps. And also we think that similar critiques might also be made of other thinkers who don't explicitly use the term real subsumption, but kind of are indicating a kind of similar kind of picture thinking in a way. So we were thinking like Frederick Jameson, Mario Tronti. So we were wondering what you thought about those thinkers and whether you think that what we're saying about false totalisation is valid or if it can apply to other forms of thinking. So the second question was about, I mean, I don't know the answer to this at the moment, but I'd really like to work it out. It's a kind of basic question about why real subsumption in particular has become such a compelling concept or image for people thinking about the difficulty of struggle today. Why not reification, alienation, etc., like a host of other concepts that we could use. And is this just the kind of contingent result of the popularization of certain theories at a certain time? Or can we say something deeper about how real subsumption, or the character of real subsumption, is kind of symptomatic? And the third question is, this is the difficult one. If an appeal to real subsumption cannot articulate the specificity of the problem of struggle in the present moment, then what can? And then the final question, if we can decide that we are in fact not really subsumed or totally subsumed, while taking account of the specificity and the problems of the current moment in terms of struggle, does this have particular implications for how we think about our relation to struggles?
Thank you so much. And then we can have 2.5 quick questions.
2.5.
Yeah, the half is mine, that I just want to. I was wondering whether the board's notion of totality will enter in your group of thinkers that you are.
Yeah, probably. I haven't interacted with board for a long time, so I can't really think exactly clearly what it would be like. But that sounds. It sounds like I think he probably would be prone to the same modality.
So we have
Is that
two.
the half question?
Yeah, that's the
That's
half.
the half question.
A proper question.
Yeah, no. I was thinking, in my mind, I was also drawing an analogy with perhaps another concept that became very attractive, maybe around the same time, maybe a bit before real subsumption, and how it registered in the kind of cultural sphere and elsewhere, which was labor, right? Everything becoming a form of labor. We are all producing value, you know, this kind of thing.
Art, theoretical discourse.
Yeah. Immaterial, and it comes from immaterial labor, perhaps, as well, but that effective labor as well. And I think there's probably a sort of a similar kind of symptom there to real subsumption.
Yeah.
I think in the sense that there's a desire to inscribe heterogeneous phenomena and activity under a category that seems to have concrete, political, economic, critical,
Yeah.
descriptive purpose.
And that also the concept of real subsumption and immaterial labour are particularly compelling to that figure of the artist as well. It kind of comes together under the same.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, when you, in response to your question, is why are people so drawn to real subsumption today? I couldn't help thinking of people being drawn to redescribing or rearticulating their activity and lots of activities as labor.
It's almost like there's a sense that there was the real subsumption thing. There was this sort of autonomist moment in all of that stuff, right? Where everything got sort of ontologized as labour, or in that very positive kind of slightly creaky way of getting autonomism. And then in some ways it feels like real subsumption is a sort of simple negation of that or something. It's like, no, everything isn't positive, it isn't all labour, it's all capital, or it's all negative or something, right? It's almost like you could sort of view that shift in those terms or something.
Yeah, although the all functions very similarly. In the end, you kind of end up saying it's all capital.
Yeah.
It's just whether we are sort of magically overcoming it.
So half a comment. No, it's a little bit maybe like to look at it from the other end of kind of history of maybe kind of Marxist thought or communist thought. There's like I was always fascinated by around the kind of 1920s Labour government in the UK. There was like a massive split by kind of more sort of left communist, bit syndicalist faction who saw the kind of introduction of welfare provision, specifically at this time like national insurance by the Labour Party, as like a kind of disastrous philanthropic venture, which basically up until that point the basis of like organising the working class had been a matter of like the class itself being in charge of its own reproduction and kind of syndicalising that, and so it saw it as like a big challenge, and it in a way was a certain kind of like to a certain extent a kind of fatal split in the British Labour movement, or was perceived as such by some people. So I was just kind of interested in that, maybe to sort of maybe leave this term subsumption, but think about the stake of a communist politics in the reproduction of kind of the working class, and interventions in it as a threat in some sense.
You want to ask that question, Mitra, or you rather prefer to wait after? Or?
It's more like a clarification.
Okay.
It's kind of two things. First, like you mentioned Robert Brenner's criticism of Alieta, but I didn't understand if Robert Brenner says that the reproduction cannot be. So I can't remember. It was to do with whether Brenner directly criticizes the description of whether he says that in the early period that is being criticized is periodized in that way. He says that reproduction cannot be separated from the reproduction of capital already from the beginning. Is that what he's saying? Because it seems to me that kind of the most useful kind of tool in that periodization was a kind of progressive integration, or maybe use the word subsumptionism, I'm not sure, of proletarian reproduction or the reproduction of life, social material life under the reproduction of capital. So I think you could conceive that as a progressive sort of increase of that integration. And so I wonder if actually Brenner was criticizing that concept as well. And if you're criticizing that concept as well.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing to remember with Brenner is, I mean, it's a very kind of elaborate critique, that, so I haven't read it for quite a long time, so I can't retrace all of the steps, but I mean, Brenner's famous for having done this sort of deep historical account of the origins of capitalism, right, which the kind of the radical shift in that he pulls off with that stuff is to show that you have to look to agriculture, really, right, that there is a dramatic increase in agricultural productivity, which enables all these, you know, the reproduction of these workers in the towns. It's not just through the Industrial Revolution or whatever. So the fact that there's a capitalisation of agriculture first, and who's eating that food that's being produced, of course, it's workers, right? So in that sense, yeah, it is the reproduction of the working class that is at stake and is entwined with reproduction capital from right at the very beginning. And he makes the criticism of Aglietta that we sort of borrowed to criticise TC, which is that there's a notable national specificity about France in this question, right? Because post-revolutionary France, there was massive land redistribution, and so long into capital, like in the 20th century, there was still a large kind of peasantry with all these small holdings, right? Who were able to reproduce themselves in a quite different way to in other countries like in England or in the States. Or, so it may be that their interpretation is slightly distorted through this national particularity or something.
Okay, so let's connect with Beirut.
Voy a poner la bocina, ¿no? ¿Qué cosa? Boterino, ¿no? Sí. ¿Podemos hacer un pequeño break?
Vale. Hi, Ray. So we're just kind of changing now here a bit, and maybe we can inform you of what's been